I remember the smell before I remember the sound. Roses and champagne and candle wax mixing into a sweetness that made my stomach turn. The ballroom at the Drake Hotel glowed gold under its chandeliers, every crystal polished to perfection, every guest rehearsed in elegance. My stepbrother Ethan stood at the center in his tuxedo, beaming beside his bride. I adjusted the cuff of my navy silk suit, the fabric suddenly too tight against my skin. I had told myself I was here only for appearance to keep the peace for one night. But peace was never something my father believed in. Robert Leland stood near the grand piano, silver hair, immaculate posture, military straight. He had built his empire the same way he built fear, by controlling every room he entered. When he caught sight of me, his smile tightened, the kind of smile that hid knives. He raised a crystal glass. The music softened. "Tonight," he announced, his voice commanding enough to silence 300 people, "we celebrate not just love but family. And family gives back. My daughter Grace will cover the remaining $1 million owed for the wedding." Laughter rippled across the tables. Champagne flutes clinked. My breath caught midair. For a second, I thought he was joking. Then I saw his eyes, cold, deliberate. He was testing my obedience in public the way he always had in private. I forced a polite smile. "That is not going to happen," I said evenly. The microphone caught my voice, sending it through the speakers like a quiet thunder. The room went still. My father's face flushed crimson. "Excuse me?" he asked, though it was not a question. I met his gaze. "I'm not paying for a wedding I wasn't even invited to plan." A murmur spread among the guests. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his bride's hand tightening on his arm. My father's jaw locked. "You ungrateful brat," he hissed, stepping closer. I could smell the bourbon on his breath. "After everything I have given you, this is how you repay me." The air thickened. My heart pounded against the scar hidden beneath my blouse from a long-forgotten childhood fall, the same scar he once told me made me imperfect. I straightened my spine. "You haven't given me anything that wasn't already yours to take back," I said. "I pay my own bills. I owe you nothing." His hand trembled around the glass. For a heartbeat, I thought he might throw it. Instead, he slammed it onto the table. "You think your success means you can disrespect your family?" he shouted. The bride's mother gasped. Cameras froze mid-air. I tried to step away to end it before it escalated. That was when he grabbed my arm. His grip was iron fingers digging into muscle. Pain shot up my shoulder. "Let go," I warned quietly. But Robert Leland had never known the meaning of restraint. The next few seconds splintered into fragments, the glint of silver on the dining table, the sound of crystal shattering, a scream, mine or someone else's, I could not tell. Then the searing pain tore through my shoulder as he drove the steak knife into me. The shock was worse than the wound. My knees buckled. The band stopped playing. Guests rose, shouting chaos blooming in slow motion. I saw Ethan's face pale and useless, frozen beside his bride. My father stood above me, chest-heaving eyes empty of regret. Blood soaked through the silk of my jacket, spreading warmth across my ribs. I fell backward, knocking over a chair, the floor rushing up in a blur of white linen and gold confetti. Someone screamed for an ambulance. Someone else cried, "He stabbed her!" The chandelier above me fractured into 1,000 reflections, each one capturing my humiliation from a different angle. The violinist's bow snapped midair. The scent of roses turned to iron. My vision flickered at the edges like a dying film reel. My father's voice came through the haze, low and furious. "You brought this on yourself." Then hands were on me, strangers, paramedics, I couldn't tell. I heard the words deep puncture and losing blood. My mind drifted somewhere between pain and disbelief. I wanted to scream, but my lungs refused. Instead, I stared up at the ceiling, counting the lights. 1, 2, 3, anything to stay conscious. As they lifted me onto a stretcher, I caught a glimpse of my father being restrained by 2 men in suits, not uniforms. His lawyer was already there whispering to him. Of course he was. Outside, the winter air hit like glass. The flashing lights painted the hotel facade red and blue. The sirens wailed, but inside my head there was only silence. I thought of my mother's photograph, the one I kept hidden in a drawer. She had warned me once, "He will never love you the way you deserve. Protect yourself when the time comes." I had laughed then, calling her dramatic. Now her voice echoed like prophecy. As the ambulance doors closed, I felt the cold seep through the blanket. My hand trembled, fingers slick with my own blood. A paramedic pressed gauze to my wound, shouting vitals I couldn't follow. I looked through the small rear window at the ballroom fading behind us, lights still flashing the night, still young for everyone else. Somewhere inside that glittering building, my father would already be calling his lawyer, spinning the narrative. The story would become a misunderstanding, a daughter too emotional, a father pushed too far. The world would believe him because he had money, because he had always won. But as the sirens screamed down Michigan Avenue, one thought anchored me to consciousness. He might own the story now, but he would not own the ending. I closed my eyes against the blur of neon and cold and pain. The last thing I heard before darkness claimed me was the paramedic's voice shouting, "Stay with us, Grace!" I did, barely. The first thing I registered was the beeping, slow, steady, mechanical, then the sterile smell of disinfectant and the burn in my shoulder that flared when I tried to move. I opened my eyes to a ceiling painted too white, the kind of white that pretends to be clean, but only reminds you of pain. A nurse stood over me adjusting an IV bag. Her badge read, Mercy Hospital, Chicago. She noticed my eyes flicker open and smiled the way people smile at the wounded, polite and distant. "You're safe now," she said softly. Safe. The word felt foreign. My throat was dry. My voice cracked when I asked, "How long?" 6 hours since surgery, she said. "You lost a lot of blood, but you're stable." My fingers moved toward the bandage on my shoulder. Thick layers of gauze pressed against stitches that pulled when I breathed. My mind replayed flashes of the ballroom, the knife, the screaming, the cold eyes of my father. The nurse checked my vitals, then hesitated. "There are officers outside. They want a statement when you're ready." I nodded weakly. Minutes later, 2 uniformed men entered. One spoke first, his notebook already open. "Ms. Leland, can you tell us what happened?" I told them what I could. The announcement, the argument, the knife. My words came out brittle. When I finished, the older officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Several guests mentioned the lights were dim and people were standing. No one saw the actual moment, he said carefully. "Your father claims he slipped, that you moved suddenly." My stomach turned. He stabbed me intentionally. I said the words, scraping my throat raw. He had a knife. He looked me in the eyes. The younger officer scribbled something. "We'll continue the investigation," he said, tone flat. He was released pending investigation due to lack of eyewitness statements and powerful legal counsel. Released. Of course. My pulse spiked under the monitor. "He's free," I whispered. "For now, yes," the older one said. "We'll contact you if we need further information." They left, and the silence pressed heavier than the pain. The nurse returned with medication. I swallowed it dry eyes, unfocused on the heart monitor's steady line. Evening shadows crawled across the room by the time Ethan arrived. He looked smaller than I remembered, guilt pulling his shoulders inward. "Grace," he said, voice trembling. I turned away. "He's sorry," he blurted out. He said it was an accident. He was drunk. He didn't stop. I cut him off. My throat burned. "Don't repeat his script to me." Ethan flinched. Mom's worried. She's outside." I hesitated, then nodded once. Marianne entered quietly, her designer coat draped over shaking arms. Her face was pale eyes, rimmed red. She sat by the bed and reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. "Grace, please," she whispered. "You know how he gets when he drinks. This family is under so much pressure right now. The company, the wedding, if this gets out, I laughed sharp and humorless. "He stabbed me, Marianne." "Not spilled wine on me," her lips quivered. "You can't ruin him over one mistake." "One mistake!" My voice rose until the monitor beeped faster. The nurse appeared in the doorway, but I waved her off. "He could have killed me," And he's ashamed, Marianne said quickly. He said you provoked him, that you embarrassed him in front of everyone. Please, Grace, don't press charges. We can handle this privately. Don't destroy what's left of our family. The room blurred with tears I refused to let fall. For years, I had played the role of peacekeeper, the silent daughter, the professional who smoothed chaos for everyone but herself. I looked at her perfectly manicured nails gripping her purse, the same hands that had clapped for Ethan's speech hours before I bled on her floor. I forced myself to speak calmly. You came here not to check if I'm alive, but to protect him. She swallowed hard. You don't understand. He's your father. I turned my face to the window. No, he's your husband. The silence between us was final. After a long moment, she reached into her purse, pulled out an envelope. This will cover your medical bills, she murmured. I stared at it without touching. You can leave it on the tray. She placed it there and stood adjusting her coat. Please don't talk to the press, she said softly before leaving. The door closed. The envelope remained a white accusation against the sterile metal table. I stared at it until the edges blurred. Hours passed. The morphine dulled the pain, but not the ache behind my ribs. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, each flake drifting like ash. A television somewhere in the hallway played muted news, holiday sales, weather alerts. Nothing about me. I was invisible again, just like before. I thought about the officers, about the careful words, pending investigation, the way power rewrote truth. My father was likely sitting in his penthouse now, drink in hand, rehearsing remorse for the cameras. He would win sympathy because men like him always did. The heart monitor beeped in rhythm with my anger. I pressed the call button. The nurse appeared. Could you turn off the light? I asked quietly. When she left, darkness filled the room except for the machines blinking steady. I whispered to the empty air. He took everything once. He won't again. The words tasted like blood and promise. Snowflakes gathered on the window ledge, melting into thin streams of water, tracing paths down the glass like silent tears. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the monitor carry me somewhere between fury and exhaustion. Outside, the city lights flickered uncaring, while inside I began to count the seconds not to sleep, but to plan. The painkillers blurred the edges of reality until memories began seeping through the cracks. I was 6 again, sitting on the polished floor of my father's office, surrounded by toy trucks and the smell of his cologne mixed with cigar smoke. Robert Leland was already a giant in my eyes, towering behind a mahogany desk that gleamed like still water. He smiled when I showed him a crayon drawing of our house and said one day, "All this will be yours, Grace, if you work hard enough and never show weakness." I believed him with the blind faith children reserve for gods and fathers. Back then, he called me his golden girl. Every dinner was a lesson in power, and every compliment came with a condition. He'd ask, "What did you learn today?" And if I didn't answer fast enough, he'd say, "Disappointment is louder than failure." I learned to be silent quickly. My mother Evelyn was the softness that balanced his steel. She used to tuck me into bed, whispering, "You don't have to earn love." She said it like a secret, like something dangerous. Then cancer took her when I was 12, and the house turned into an echo. The day of her funeral, my father didn't cry. He stood by the grave in a black coat, unmoved, while I clung to his sleeve. On the drive home, he said people die, but business lives, and I understood that grief wasn't allowed in our family ledger. Months later, he remarried. Marianne arrived with perfect hair and a nervous laugh that filled rooms like perfume sweet and hard to breathe. She was kind at first, bringing me cocoa at night, but kindness in our house had an expiration date. When Ethan was born, everything shifted. Suddenly, the nursery took over my mother's old studio, and family portraits were retaken with me pushed to the side. My golden girl frame disappeared from the mantel, replaced by a baby in blue silk. At 16, I stopped expecting a seat at the table. I became the ghost who fetched coffee at company dinners, the quiet overachiever whose grades filled the space of affection. At school, teachers called me driven, but what they didn't see were the bruises on my confidence left by years of his corrections. If I came home with a 98, he'd ask where the other 2 points went. I learned early that love in our house was transactional. When I turned 18, he handed me an envelope with college tuition and said, "You're on your own now." His eyes softened just enough to make me believe it was pride, not relief. I left for Northwestern with one suitcase and the burning need to prove I was more than his unfinished project. While other students were finding themselves, I was constructing armor. Finance became my language control, my religion. Numbers didn't lie, they didn't hit back. I graduated early, took an internship on Wall Street, and climbed until my name appeared in magazines not because of him, but in spite of him. Yet every success carried his ghost. Each promotion felt like an argument I'd won too late. I remember the first time he acknowledged my work. It was at a charity gala in New York when I was 30. He approached me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "I read about your firm. You've done well for a woman your age." Then he introduced me to investors as my daughter Grace, the one who loves to play with numbers as if my career were a hobby. That night, I stared at the Manhattan skyline from my hotel window and realized pride from him was always a weapon disguised as approval. Years later, when I returned to Chicago to expand my firm, he invited me to dinner for the first time in a decade. Mary Ann served roast lamb, and Ethan, now a rising executive in the family company, toasted to unity. My father said, "Family is everything." Grace and I nodded because disagreeing in that house was still a crime. But when he asked me to join Leland Logistics as CFO, I refused. I had built my own empire brick by brick without his shadow. His smile froze. "You'll regret that," he said. Maybe he was right, but not in the way he thought. After that dinner, communication dwindled again. Holiday cards arrived, unsigned invitations to events were sent more from obligation than desire. The only time my name surfaced in their circle was when my success benefited their image. I heard through colleagues that Robert boasted about his self-made daughter on panels, but never once returned my calls. The distance became routine until the night Ethan called me crying, saying, "Dad's heart isn't good. He's in the hospital, he wants to see you." Against my better judgment, I went. Robert lay in a private suite surrounded by monitors and expensive silence. He looked small for once fragile even. When he saw me, his eyes watered, and for a moment, I thought maybe this was the reckoning we needed. He said, "You're doing well, Grace. I'm proud." Those words should have healed something, but they didn't. They only made me wonder why it took a hospital bed for him to speak them. A week later, he was back in boardrooms barking orders. The heart attack had not changed him, it had only reminded him of control. When he announced Ethan as the new vice president, I wasn't surprised. What cut deeper was hearing he had transferred part of my mother's trust fund to Ethan under the guise of estate restructuring. I confronted him privately, and he said, "It's family money, Grace. Family stays together." I said, "Then why am I always the outsider?" His answer was a long stare before he walked away. That was the last real conversation we had before the wedding night. In the years between, I built walls so high even my closest friends couldn't see over them. I told myself independence was protection. I worked 14-hour days, ate dinner over spreadsheets, and convinced everyone, including myself, that I didn't need him anymore. Yet every time the news featured his company, I felt the old ache, the need to be seen not as an asset or disappointment, but simply as his daughter. I used to think anger was the opposite of love, but lying there in that hospital bed after he stabbed me, I understood something darker. Indifference was the real killer. He hadn't even hesitated. There was no flicker of recognition, no pause to remember the little girl who once drew houses for him. He looked at me and saw only defiance. That night replayed in my head like an unfinished equation. The announcement, the laughter, the blade, the blood. The ghost of the golden daughter was gone, replaced by something colder. Lying in that sterile room, I realized the truth I had been running from all my life. I had spent years writing invisible letters to a father who would never read them. Every promotion, every spreadsheet, every sleepless night had been one more desperate attempt to say, "Look, I made it. Are you proud?" But pride was his currency, and I was bankrupt in his eyes. As the machines hummed around me, I whispered to no one, "I'm done asking." The words floated into the dark like ashes. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain, a seed of resolve took root. The golden daughter was gone, but the ghost she left behind was learning how to fight. The hospital released me 3 days later with stitches and painkillers and a warning to rest. but rest was impossible when your name was splashed across tabloids. The morning after I got home, my phone vibrated nonstop with headlines that reduced my trauma to gossip. Logistics mogul's daughter injured at wedding incident. Police investigating family altercation. Each article quoted anonymous guests describing confusion and panic as if my stabbing were an unfortunate scheduling mishap. Robert's publicist moved fast, releasing a statement calling it a misunderstanding during a heated emotional exchange. The phrase spread like perfume, covering the stench of violence. By noon, cable news played footage of him leaving his office looking dignified in a navy suit. Reporters shouted questions. He said, "My daughter and I love each other deeply. This was a private matter blown out of proportion." The world nodded because that was easier than confronting the truth that men like him could wound and still be worshipped. My inbox filled with polite concern from colleagues, carefully avoiding details. One message from my assistant simply read, "Take as much time as you need, we support you." Another from my firm's board reminded me to consider the company's reputation before engaging the press. Reputation. Always that word. I turned off my phone and let the silence eat the room. Days blurred into one another, measured only by the rotation of light through my blinds. I moved slowly through my apartment wrapped in the same robe I had worn since coming home. The stitches pulled each time I lifted my arm, and I welcomed the sting. It made me feel alive when everything else felt suspended. I thought about calling a lawyer, but what would I say? The officers had already closed their preliminary report, labeling it inconclusive due to insufficient evidence. Without witnesses, it would be my word against his, and his word had power. I stared at the police card on my counter until the ink of the name smudged from condensation. On the fourth day, Detective Nora Jensen appeared at my door. She was an old friend from college turned homicide detective, the kind of woman who carried calm like armor. She looked at me and didn't bother pretending. "I heard about the release," she said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She dropped a file onto my table. "Unofficial copy," she said. Inside were photos from the crime scene, my blood on white linen, my father's knife bagged and labeled. The evidence looked clinical, detached from the pain it caused. "He didn't slip," Nora said quietly. "He was facing you when it happened. That angle doesn't happen by accident." "Then why is he free?" I asked. She sighed because there's no footage and everyone at that wedding owes him something. Money favors jobs. They all said the same thing. They didn't see. She hesitated before adding, "I can't reopen it without cause, but if you ever want to pursue it, I'll help however I can." She stood to leave and looked back at me. "Grace, he didn't stab you by accident. He did it because he knew he could get away with it." After she left, her words echoed through the apartment louder than the hum of the refrigerator. Get away with it. That was his legacy. Control the story until the truth suffocates. That night, I turned on the television and watched him smiling at a charity gala, his hand on Marianne's back. The caption read, "Robert Leland attends fundraiser for child trauma victims." The irony was acid in my throat. I smashed the remote against the wall and sat in the dark, listening to my own breath. I should have been angry, but mostly I felt hollow, like someone had carved out the center of me and left the shell. For years, silence had been my survival tool, but now it felt like complicity. Still, I didn't speak. Not yet. Weeks passed. The firm suggested a temporary leave of absence to focus on healing, which sounded generous, but really meant distance yourself before we become collateral damage. I agreed. I spent mornings walking by Lake Michigan bundled in layers against the wind. The cold helped numb the thoughts that kept replaying the knife, the gasps, the disbelief. Sometimes I caught people glancing at my shoulder bandage, and I wondered if they recognized me from the news. Most didn't. To them, I was just another woman with too much sadness in her posture. At night, I avoided mirrors. The scar was still fresh red and angry. I told myself it would fade, but deep down, I knew it never would. Trauma brands you where no one can see. One evening, as snow fell heavy against the windows, I received a letter from the family attorney. It was written in perfect legalese, informing me that the family was handling matters privately and requested my cooperation in maintaining confidentiality for the sake of all parties involved. Enclosed was a check far larger than any hospital bill. Hush money disguised as concern. I tore it in half and dropped it into the sink, letting water dissolve the ink. When the phone rang later, it was Mary Ann. Her voice trembled. "Grace, please, he's worried about you." I said nothing. She continued, "The press is moving on, thank God. We can all start healing." Healing. The word twisted inside me. I wanted to ask, how do you heal from being told your pain is inconvenient? Instead, I whispered, "I hope you never find out what it feels like to bleed for a man who calls it love." I hung up before she could respond. That night, the silence felt different. Not empty, but waiting. For the first time in weeks, I slept without medication. In my dream, I stood again in the ballroom, but the chandeliers were dark and the tables empty. My father sat alone at the head table, surrounded by shadows, whispering his own name until it echoed back like a curse. I woke before dawn, heart pounding. The city outside was still asleep. I made coffee and opened the blinds, watching the first light crawl over the frozen streets. Something shifted quietly inside me. Not forgiveness, not peace, but the faint spark of resolve. He had gotten away with it for now, but truth had a way of surviving burial. The silence he built to protect himself would soon become the space I used to destroy him. I picked up Nora's card from the counter, ran my finger over the name, and whispered to the cold morning air, "Not yet, but soon." Therapy was never something I believed in until I had nothing left to believe in. My therapist, Dr. Patel, had eyes that saw through silence and a voice soft enough to make me speak when I wanted to disappear. The office smelled of sage and old books. Outside her window, Chicago moved in slow motion through the snow. She asked me one question that first session that cracked everything open. "When did you first start apologizing for other people's violence?" I didn't know the answer then, but I carried it with me for days, like a riddle I didn't want to solve. I spent weeks oscillating between numbness and rage, the kind of rage that doesn't scream but hums low and constant beneath the ribs. Some mornings I would wake, convinced I imagined it all, that maybe he really did slip. Then I'd lift my arm and feel the pull of the scar and remember the sound of the blade against bone. Healing isn't linear, Dr. Patel reminded me, but justice can be. You don't have to choose one or the other. I told her I wasn't ready for revenge. She smiled that small, knowing smile and said, "Then start with truth. Truth." The word followed me home. It lingered while I paid bills, while I stared at the corporate documents piled on my desk. The numbers used to comfort me, but now they mocked me, rows and columns of order in a world that rewarded chaos. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since college. The pages filled with fragments, memories of my mother's warnings, of my father's lessons on power, of the night he turned those lessons on me. Each entry made the picture clearer. He didn't stab me because he was drunk. He did it because I defied him publicly. It wasn't rage, it was control. He needed to remind everyone, including me, who held the power. One night, while flipping through channels, I stopped cold. On screen, my father stood at a podium accepting the Father-Son Business Legacy Award with Ethan at his side. The audience clapped as he said, "Family is the backbone of success." Ethan smiled awkwardly into the camera while Robert laid a hand on his shoulder, the same hand that had held a knife against me. The applause felt like static in my ears. My fingers tightened around the remote until it cracked. I muted the sound and stared at the caption beneath his name. Robert Leland, visionary leader, philanthropist, devoted father. My reflection stared back from the black TV screen, hollow-eyed and trembling. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and sat on the floor. The cold tiles steadied me. I traced the edge of the scar through my shirt and whispered, "He took my blood and turned it into applause, but not anymore." The next morning, I woke with clarity sharp enough to cut through fog. I opened my laptop and started searching public corporate records. I knew how his company worked from the inside out. I had helped him design parts of the financial infrastructure when I was in grad school. I knew where he hid losses, how he moved money through shell vendors. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had built the system that would one day destroy him. At first, it was small details, discrepancies in supplier invoices, payments routed through the same offshore entity with different names. The deeper I went, the more patterns appeared. Millions shifted every quarter, disguised as consulting fees. It was textbook laundering. Still, I hesitated. Going after him would mean going to war with someone who had never lost. He had lawyers, politicians, banks. I had truth, but truth without proof was noise. For a week, I hovered between fear and determination until something unexpected arrived: a letter from the state's attorney's office addressed to me. They were reopening the investigation due to new testimony from an anonymous witness who claimed to have seen the knife strike. I read the letter twice, heart racing. Someone had finally spoken. I didn't know who, but it cracked the silence wide open. When I told Dr. Patel, she said maybe the universe responds when we stop staying quiet. That night, I dreamed of my mother again, standing in the doorway of my childhood room. She said softly, "You don't win by becoming him. You win by surviving him." When I woke before dawn, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about reclamation. I called Detective Nora and told her I had information she might want to see. We met at a diner off Wabash, the kind that smelled of burnt coffee and nostalgia. I slid a flash drive across the table. She looked at me carefully. "Grace, what's on it?" I said the reason he always walked free. She didn't ask more, just nodded and pocketed it. "You sure about this?" she asked. "Once this starts, there's no going back." I said I'm sure. After she left, I sat for a long time staring at the window fogged from the heat inside. Outside, snow turned to freezing rain. Cars crawled past headlights smeared by water. The city looked washed of color, like someone had drained it just to see what would remain. For the first time, I didn't feel afraid of what came next. Fear had already done its worst. Over the next few weeks, I pieced together everything I could find using skills honed over years in finance. I built timelines, traced transactions, documented every wire transfer that smelled of deceit. My apartment became a war room of spreadsheets and notes taped to walls. Each discovery was another thread unraveling his empire. Some nights, exhaustion clawed at me, but the memory of his voice kept me moving. "You think you can survive without me?" he once said. I whispered back into the empty room, "Watch me." The news eventually reported that the reopening of the investigation had led to subpoenas of several of his companies. Commentators debated whether the great Robert Leland would finally face consequences. His lawyers issued a statement calling it politically motivated. I didn't respond. I stayed quiet because quiet was my weapon now, the calm before the storm. When Ethan called begging me to stop, I said I didn't start this. He hung up in tears, and I almost felt sorry for him almost. Dr. Patel asked me one last time during our session, "What do you want from all this?" I answered without hesitation. I want him to know that the thing he built to make himself untouchable will be the same thing that breaks him. She nodded slowly, then said, "Then, Grace, you're not seeking revenge. You're seeking balance." The word settled deep in my bones like warmth after years of cold. That night, I stood on my balcony watching snow dissolve into rain. The city shimmered beneath me, alive and indifferent. Somewhere out there, he was still telling his version of the story. But I had stopped listening. I closed the door behind me and turned off my phone. Tomorrow I would start tracing the money. Tomorrow I would begin again. Detective Nora met me again 2 days later at her precinct office, a cramped space smelling of paper and burnt coffee. She looked tired but sharp, her eyes flicking from her screen to me with that mix of curiosity and concern only cops have when they know you're about to cross a line. She said the financial records you sent opened a lot of questions. We traced one shell account to a logistics supplier that doesn't exist. The payment trail goes through Belize, then into a Delaware LLC owned by a trust in your father's name. It's sophisticated but not invisible. I asked if it was enough for charges. "Not yet," she said. "We need corroboration, and you know he'll bury it under lawyers the minute he smells risk." I told her I could get more. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms. "Grace, what are you planning?" I smiled thinly. To finish what he started. She sighed, but didn't stop me. She knew I'd already made my choice. I spent nights combing through data, my laptop glowing in the dark like a portal. I broke down contracts line by line, matching invoice dates to shipping manifests, cross-checking supplier addresses with property records. Every clue led to another layer of deceit. He had built an empire, not of steel and trucks, but of shadows and signatures. By week's end, I had found a series of irregular deposits tied to board members' spouses, kickbacks disguised as consulting retainers. When I sent the file to Nora, she called within minutes saying, "This is Big Grace. You realize you're implicating half the board, right?" I said, "Good, then none of them will turn on each other before it's too late." My voice surprised even me, calm calculated like his once was. Nora said, "There's something else you should know. The DA's office reopened your assault case officially. That witness we mentioned came forward with more details. Turns out he was a waiter that night. He saw your father grab you first, then lunge. He was afraid to talk before. Money changed hands afterward. I felt the air leave my lungs. Finally, someone had seen. Nora said, if you want to testify, we can fold both cases together. Financial crimes plus assault pattern of abuse. It'll hit harder." I agreed. When I hung up, the apartment felt smaller than ever, filled with ghosts of spreadsheets and echoes of that night. I went for a walk along the river, the icy wind cutting through my coat. Chicago looked both endless and claustrophobic lights reflected in the black water like broken glass. I thought about power and how fragile it really was. My father believed fear was currency. I was learning that truth was inflation. That weekend, I met with Alex Tran, the investigative journalist I'd contacted months ago. He sat across from me at a quiet bar, his notebook ready, but his eyes wary. "You sure you want to go on record?" he asked. "This could blow up everywhere." I nodded. "Just hold the story until I tell you." He flipped through the documents I brought. "Christ, Grace, this is federal-level fraud. Offshore laundering, tax evasion, bribery. You're sitting on a bomb." I said, "Then let's make sure it explodes in the right direction." Alex promised to cross-verify with his editors and protect my identity until publication. When I left the bar, snow had started again, soft, steady, relentless. Each flake felt like a countdown. Over the next month, Nora and I built a web tight enough to choke him. Subpoenas were issued quietly through sealed warrants. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit joined under the radar. I was summoned for depositions that lasted hours, each question pulling more of the past into the light. Some nights I thought about quitting the exhaustion bone deep, but every time I touched the scar on my shoulder, I remembered why I couldn't. During one of our late meetings, Nora said something that stuck. "He's not untouchable, Grace. He's just used to people being afraid." The moment that fear cracks, his whole world collapses. I realized she was right. For decades, he had thrived because no one dared call him what he was, a violent man hiding behind respectability. Now the walls were shifting. Marianne tried calling multiple times, leaving messages, half apology, half warning. Ethan texted, "Please stop, you'll destroy everything." I didn't reply. They were collateral in a war they helped create. One evening, I broke into the office building that housed one of his subsidiaries using an access badge I still had from a consulting project years before. The security guards didn't question a woman in a suit carrying files. Inside, I found an archive room lined with paper contracts. I copied files showing falsified freight routes, millions in phantom shipments. I hid the copies under my coat, heart hammering as I walked out past the front desk. The thrill terrified me, but also fueled me. For the first time, the fear was his, not mine. When Nora saw the evidence, she shook her head. "This will bury him, but we need to time it right. Let the investigation mature, then hit with both barrels." I trusted her. A week later, I received a summons to appear before the grand jury. Sitting in that windowless room, answering questions under oath, I felt something close to peace. Every yes and no was a small reclamation of the voice he had stolen. The prosecutor asked why I decided to come forward now. I said because silence was protecting the wrong person. My words hung in the air, heavy enough to tilt the room. When I left the courthouse, reporters were already gathering. Cameras flashed, questions flew. I said nothing, just walked past them head high. That night I got an email from Alex. "The story's almost ready. We're verifying with federal sources. Once this drops, there's no going back." I typed back 2 words. "Do it." The next morning, the Wall Street Sentinel called my phone for comment. I declined. By afternoon, Robert's lawyers had filed motions accusing unnamed individuals of defamation. Panic was spreading through his empire faster than snowmelt. Stocks fluctuated. Partners hesitated. For the first time in my life, I saw cracks in the fortress he had built. Yet part of me felt the weight of it too. Ethan innocent in his loyalty. Marianne trapped in her own gilded cage. I wondered if vengeance ever came without casualties. Dr. Patel once said, "Revenge is fire. You can cook with it, or you can burn the house down." I was learning to aim the flame. One night, Nora called to tell me the FBI had executed search warrants at 2 of his offices. They seized hard drives and financial ledgers. "He knows you're behind it," she warned. "Be careful." I looked at the city lights outside my window and said, "I'm not hiding anymore." The next day, my father called. His voice was steady, too calm. "Grace, let's meet," he said. "Family should talk, not fight. I said I'll see you in court," and hung up. The silence afterward felt like freedom. Everything was in motion, now unstoppable. Truth was no longer fragile. It was a weapon sharpened by time and blood. I sat on the edge of my bed, breathing in the cold air leaking through the window cracks, and realized the girl who once begged for approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that justice isn't handed down by courts or headlines. It's built piece by piece by those who refuse to stay broken, and I wasn't broken anymore. When the article finally hit the front page, it detonated like a bomb. Leland Empire built on fraud and fear. The headline screamed in bold type beneath a photo of my father shaking hands with a senator. The piece detailed decades of money laundering shell accounts and offshore transfers, naming board members and lobbyists in one sweeping indictment of corruption. The quotes from insiders read like confessions whispered through clenched teeth. Within hours, television anchors debated his fall from grace. His lawyers issued statements calling it fiction crafted by disgruntled former employees, but the damage was done. I watched it unfold from my apartment, gripping a mug of coffee that had gone cold. My phone buzzed non-stop calls from reporters, friends, even strangers telling me I was brave. I wasn't brave, I was tired. By noon, my father's company stock had dropped 45%, wiping out millions. The empire that once seemed untouchable was bleeding out in real time. But power doesn't die quietly. That evening, Ethan showed up at my door, drenched from the freezing rain. His eyes were wild and desperate. "Grace, what did you do?" he demanded. "You destroyed everything." I let him in because despite everything, he was still my brother. He paced the room, his hands shaking. "Dad's losing contracts. The banks are freezing assets. You think this makes you righteous? You've ruined hundreds of jobs," I said quietly. He did that himself. He stared at me, and for the first time, I saw him not as the golden boy, but as another victim of our father's manipulation. He was raised to protect the name, not the truth. He rubbed his temples, muttering, "He's furious, Grace. He said if you push this further, he'll come after you." I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "He already did, Ethan. The scar is proof." Ethan's face crumpled. "I didn't know he whispered. I thought he just lost control that night." "You thought because that's easier than seeing him for what he is," I said softly. He sat down on the couch, defeated. "What happens now?" "Justice," I said. "Real justice." A knock interrupted us. It was Nora, her expression unreadable but urgent. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside. "The FBI's charging him formally, but they think someone inside leaked details to warn him. He's been moving money again, trying to secure what's left offshore." Ethan's head snapped up. "That's impossible. The accounts are frozen." "Not all of them," Nora replied. "He still has influence. We think one of his executives is hiding assets for him under a new holding company. If we find it before he transfers, we can lock it down." I looked at her. "I can trace it." She nodded. "We'll need it fast." After she left, Ethan stood and said, "Let me help." I hesitated. "You owe him nothing, Ethan." He shook his head. "Maybe, but I owe Zoe everything." Zoe. The daughter he had with his wife 2 years ago. I'd only met her once, but her laugh still echoed in my mind. He said I don't want her growing up thinking that man's version of success is the only one. For the first time, I believed him. We worked through the night, poring over financial statements until numbers blurred into symbols. Around dawn, we found a pattern hidden in real estate purchases through a shell named Meridian Transit Group. The name was new, but the signature was his. Ethan stared at the screen. That's it. I sent the file to Nora immediately. Within hours, federal agents raided a storage facility registered under Meridian, seizing documents and computer drives. News broke before noon. My father's empire was officially collapsing, but victory came with consequences. That evening, Marianne called sobbing. Grace, please, he's losing everything. He's threatening people. He says he'll destroy you before they take him. I said, Marianne, if he tries, it will only make his sentence longer. She begged me to stop. For a moment, I almost softened. Then I remembered her voice in the hospital telling me not to ruin him over one mistake. I hung up. Later that night, Alex messaged me a link. It was a leaked email from one of the board members to investors admitting they'd known about fraudulent dealings for years, but stayed silent because they feared retaliation. The story had spiraled beyond my control. Public opinion turned fast. Protesters gathered outside Leland headquarters demanding accountability. Politicians who once praised my father now condemned him. Watching the footage, I felt both satisfaction and unease. Power had shifted, but chaos had taken its place. Nora called again, saying he's furious cornered. He blames you for everything. You need to be careful. I looked out at the snow swirling against my window. I'm done being careful. 2 nights later, Ethan came back looking pale. He said he went to see Dad at his mansion. He's not well, Grace. He's drinking. He barely sleeps. He kept saying he made you and he can unmake you. I told Ethan to stay away, but he shook his head. He's still my father. I said, then pray he never becomes your enemy. That night, I received an unmarked envelope slipped under my door. Inside were photographs of me leaving my office, eating lunch, walking alone. No note, no sender, just surveillance. My pulse spiked. I called Nora immediately. She said, we'll increase patrol near your building, but Grace, this is what he does. Intimidation. Don't let him win. Her voice steadied me. Still, I slept with a kitchen knife by my bed. The next morning, Alex called. One of his sources heard your father plans to hold a press conference to deny everything. He'll probably attack you publicly. Let him, I said. Every word will tighten the rope he's already tied around his neck. And it did. The next day, he appeared on national television blaming rogue employees and claiming the investigation was politically motivated, led by an ungrateful daughter seeking attention. I watched the broadcast from my office, surrounded by reporters waiting for my response. When he finished, I turned off the screen. My voice was calm. We don't answer lies with noise. We answer them with evidence. Alex smiled. Then let's show them. He published a follow-up exposé with video evidence and leaked recordings of board meetings where my father threatened employees. The public backlash was immediate and vicious. Sponsors withdrew. Lawsuits piled up. Within days, Robert Leland was summoned to appear before Congress. The man who once lectured me about control now had none. Yet despite everything, a strange sorrow lingered. This was still my father, the man whose shadow shaped every decision I'd ever made. Nora visited one evening with updates. He'll be arrested within the week, she said. Federal charges, racketeering, tax fraud, assault. He's cornered Grace. It's over. I wanted to believe her, but part of me knew men like him always had one move left. Still, I nodded. When she left, I poured a glass of wine and stared out the window at the city glittering under snow. For years, he had been the architect of my silence. Now his empire lay in ruins because I learned to speak. And yet I didn't feel triumph. Just the quiet exhaustion of someone who'd finally finished a marathon that began in childhood. Power built on fear had fallen, but the echoes remained. Tomorrow he would face justice. Tonight I would let myself breathe. I turned off the lights and whispered into the darkness. He can't touch me anymore. Not in the world that's coming. The morning after the televised denial, I woke before dawn to the soft hum of the city below my apartment and the ache of exhaustion behind my eyes. The investigation was closing in, but the victory still felt incomplete, like a chess game where the king refuses to fall. My father still had influence and enough hidden wealth to survive even ruin. I needed to ensure that when the empire fell, there would be nothing left for him to rebuild. That meant turning his own tactics against him. Over the following days, I mapped every entity still tied to his name, cross-referencing corporate registries from Delaware to Zurich. Buried in the filings, I found a small dormant holding company registered 5 years earlier, Leland Pacific Investments, a shell designed for future acquisitions. The documents listed no active directors. That was the gap I needed. I could legally establish an anonymous entity to acquire controlling shares in one of his subsidiaries under that dormant umbrella. A corporate ghost buying back the bones of his empire. It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. I called an old colleague from my finance days, a quiet genius named Daniel who specialized in trust law. He owed me a favor. Over coffee, I explained what I wanted: a legitimate shell corporation set up through a trust with my identity concealed. He hesitated only a moment. "Grace, this is legal," he said, "but it's also personal. You sure you can keep the two separate?" I looked at him steadily. They were never separate to begin with. Within 48 hours, the paperwork was complete. I became the anonymous founder of Northbridge Holdings, registered in Delaware, owned by a trust headquartered in Nevada, where beneficiary records are sealed by law. Using Northbridge, I began acquiring shares in the one company my father hadn't yet stripped for parts: Leland Freight Systems, the crown jewel of his logistics network. The public stock had plummeted after the scandal, making the takeover surprisingly affordable. I liquidated some of my own assets, the firm I'd built from scratch, the apartment near the river, and quietly funneled the funds into Northbridge. Every purchase brought me closer to controlling stake. It was risky, but it was the only language my father truly understood: ownership. While I moved in silence, the legal system thundered on. Federal agents raided more of his offices, uncovering falsified ledgers and bribe trails. He was subpoenaed for testimony, but his lawyers kept delaying hearings. Marianne called again, crying, saying he was drinking himself into oblivion. I listened without speaking until she said, "He keeps asking why you hate him." I answered evenly, "I don't hate him, I just stopped fearing him." Then I hung up. Each night, I sat surrounded by papers illuminated by a single desk lamp, tracing every strand of his power until I saw the full picture: a network designed not for commerce, but for control. He had built it to own people. I was dismantling it to set them free. Alex kept me updated on the fallout. Sponsors pulled funding, politicians distanced themselves. Yet he warned me there's talk of a counter-story leaking, soon one that paints you as unstable, vindictive. He's still trying to rewrite the narrative. I smiled thinly. Let him write. I'm building the ending. By the end of the second month, Northbridge Holdings owned 43% of Leland Freight, enough to influence decisions but not yet majority control. I needed one more piece. Ethan called one evening, his voice strained. "Dad's selling off his personal shares to raise legal fees. If someone buys them through the open market, he'll never know." I said quietly, "I already am." He exhaled. "Then maybe it's over." I didn't answer because I knew it wasn't. True endings are never that clean. 2 weeks later, I received confirmation Northbridge now held 51% of Leland Freight Systems. I stared at the email until the words blurred. I was the controlling shareholder of the company that defined his legacy. My hands trembled as I printed the certificate of ownership. It was just paper, yet it felt like the first breath of freedom I'd ever taken. That same afternoon, Nora called. "He's been officially indicted," she said. "Racketeering, tax evasion, assault, obstruction of justice. His bail hearing is tomorrow. Are you coming?" I said no. "He'll see me when it matters." She didn't ask what I meant. That night, I stood by the window of my near-empty apartment, watching the skyline shimmer against the lake. My reflection looked different now, sharper, older maybe, but steadier. I thought of my mother, her voice saying, "Protect yourself when the time comes." The time had come. The next morning, I transferred all ownership documents and legal proof to a secure vault under Northbridge's trust. I wanted no trace leading back to me until I was ready. Then I drafted a public statement to be released once the sentencing was announced. It read simply, "Leland Freight Systems announces new ownership and rebranding under independent management, prioritizing ethical operations and employee welfare." There was no mention of me, but every word carried my signature. That afternoon, I met with Alex and Nora at a cafe tucked between courthouse buildings. Alex looked at me over his laptop. "Grace, this will end him completely. You know that, right?" I nodded. Nora added, "He won't take it well. You might want to keep security close." I said, "I'm done running." The day the court froze his remaining assets, I signed the final acquisition papers. Reporters speculated about the mysterious investor who saved the company from collapse. My father raged publicly, claiming conspiracies and betrayal. He had no idea the hand that rebuilt his empire belonged to the daughter he once tried to destroy. At night, I walked through the quiet lobby of Leland Freight's headquarters, now under Northbridge control. The marble floor gleamed beneath my footsteps, just like the ballroom that night years ago. I paused by the company plaque bearing his name and traced the engraved letters with my finger before whispering, "This doesn't belong to you anymore." When I left, I didn't look back. Power once stolen had been reclaimed not through violence, but through precision. It wasn't forgiveness, it was freedom disguised as business. The next step would be exposure, public and final. But first, I allowed myself one night of stillness. I went home, poured a glass of wine, and watched the snowfall outside. For the first time in years, the city looked peaceful. The empire had fallen, but I was still standing, and tomorrow the world would know exactly why. The morning the story broke, the city was still half asleep when my phone began vibrating across the kitchen counter. I hadn't expected it to happen that fast, but Alex worked like a storm once he had proof. The Wall Street Sentinel headline glowed on the screen, "Leland Empire built on lies daughter's evidence leads to federal indictment." Beneath it, my father's mugshot stared back, blank eyes, sunken cheeks, the image of a fallen titan. I poured coffee and stood by the window, watching dawn spread across the skyline like quiet fire. I thought I would feel triumphant, but instead, it was numbness, a hollow relief laced with disbelief. The article was devastatingly thorough. Alex had included the full paper trail we uncovered, along with the timeline of financial crimes and the confirmation from the FBI investigation. My name was nowhere in the byline, but every reader knew where the information had come from. The reaction was immediate. Financial networks ran segments on corruption and legacy. Business schools dissected how the mighty Leland Logistics collapsed under its own arrogance. The company's stock tanked another 30% within a day, wiping out what remained of his wealth. Federal prosecutors announced that Robert Leland was being held without bail, pending multiple charges. He had been arrested that morning at his estate, still wearing his silk robe when the agents came through the door. They said he didn't resist. He simply looked at the warrant and muttered figures before handing over his phone. That evening, I sat in Nora's car outside the federal courthouse as cameras flashed on the marble steps. Reporters shouted questions as he was escorted inside. His hair was disheveled, his arrogance deflated, but the stare he gave the crowd was still the same chilling mixture of contempt and entitlement. Nora turned to me and said, "You don't have to go in." I said, "I'm not here for him. I'm here to see the truth breathe." Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy. Rows of journalists lined the benches whispering notes while federal agents shuffled papers. When the judge read the charges, racketeering, tax fraud, obstruction of justice, assault, my father barely flinched, but when the prosecutor mentioned witness testimony from the assault at the wedding, his jaw tightened. That was the first crack. The judge denied bail, citing flight risk and ongoing witness intimidation. As they led him away in handcuffs, flashes exploded again. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. No words, just a flicker of recognition followed by something I had never seen in him before. Not anger, not hate, but fear. Afterward, outside the courthouse, microphones surrounded me. "Miss Leland, do you have a comment?" I said calmly. "Justice isn't vengeance. It's truth catching up." Then I walked away. Back at my apartment, the calls didn't stop. Lawyers wanted statements, networks wanted interviews, advocacy groups wanted endorsements. I declined them all. This wasn't a brand, this was my life, and I was tired of performing it. Ethan showed up that night, eyes red from crying. He said, "I saw him today, he looked so small." I said, "He always was. You just never noticed." He sat at my table, head in his hands. "They're going to seize everything." Marianne's terrified. "What will we do?" I poured him tea. "We rebuild without him." He shook his head. "You sound just like him." I froze. Then he looked up and said, "I mean focused, determined. But, Grace, don't lose yourself in this." I smiled faintly. I already found myself in this. Later, I walked him to the door, and when it closed behind him, I let out a long breath. The city below buzzed with the echo of headlines and sirens. Somewhere, a radio played a reporter's voice saying the Leland scandal marks one of the largest corporate takedowns in recent years. I sat by the window as snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. The sound reminded me of the wedding night, the silence after the scream. This time, the quiet wasn't fear, it was finality. Days blurred into hearings and depositions. I was called to testify before the grand jury. My statement was factual, clinical, stripped of emotion, but beneath every word was the weight of memory. When the prosecutor asked why I came forward, I said because silence only protects the powerful. The courtroom was silent after that. Later, as I walked down the courthouse steps, Alex caught up with me grinning. "It's done," he said. "The case is airtight. They can't spin out of this." I asked how the public was reacting. He said, "Half the country sees you as a hero, the other half as a traitor, but they're all watching." I nodded. Watching was enough. The next week, the company's board resigned en masse. The new interim CEO, a woman I had quietly supported through Northbridge, issued a statement announcing the rebranding of Leland Freight Systems into Aurora Logistics, symbolizing transparency and ethical renewal. I watched the press conference online as the old logo came down, replaced by a simple white A against a blue field. The anchor called it poetic justice. I called it closure. That night, Nora came over with takeout and a bottle of whiskey. She toasted to justice, then added, "You know he'll still try to fight it, right? There's always appeal lawyers' money somewhere hidden." I said, "Then I'll be ready." She smiled. "You're terrifying when you're calm. Maybe that's how we survive." A week later came the last confrontation I never expected. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against better judgment, I answered. "Grace." His voice rasped through the line, quieter, older. "They're taking everything he said." "You won. Are you happy now?" I closed my eyes. "No one wins in this. You just stop losing." He exhaled like he'd been punched. "You were always too soft," he muttered, then hung up. That was the last time I heard his voice. 2 days later, federal marshals seized his estate and auctioned off assets. The mansion where he once hosted senators now sat empty behind caution tape. Reporters filmed the gates closing as if sealing a tomb. I didn't watch the broadcast. Instead, I went to the lake, walked along the frozen edge until my toes went numb. The wind was sharp enough to hurt, and somehow that felt right. Pain meant the story was real. When I got home, an envelope waited by my door, no return address. Inside was a single photograph taken years ago, me standing next to him at a corporate event, both smiling for the camera. On the back was written in his handwriting, "Everything you are came from me." I burned it over the sink, watching the flames curl the paper until only ash remained. The following week, the sentencing hearing was announced. Reporters camped outside the courthouse for days. On the morning of the hearing, I wore a dark suit, simple, no jewelry, no makeup, just clarity. Inside the courtroom, he looked smaller, thinner, the arrogance stripped away. When the judge asked if he had any words before sentencing, he said, "I built this family. I built this empire, and they destroyed me." The judge responded evenly, "No, Mr. Leland, you destroyed yourself." He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. A collective sigh rippled through the room. I sat still, hands folded in my lap. When he turned to look at me, I didn't flinch. His lips moved as if to say my name, but the guards pulled him away before the sound formed. Outside, cameras waited. I stepped into the cold air and said only one thing to the crowd. Truth doesn't need applause, it needs witnesses. Then I walked away. That night, alone in my apartment, I poured the last glass of wine from an old bottle and stood by the window watching lights flicker on across the city. Somewhere people were celebrating justice. For me, it was quieter than that. Justice wasn't fireworks, it was silence, finally safe to exist in. I looked at my reflection and whispered, "You made it." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and nerves when I walked in for the final trial, the one that would decide everything. Reporters lined the benches, their pens scratching like insects as the murmurs rose and fell. Federal cases were rarely this crowded, but the collapse of an empire had turned into theater. I took my seat in the front row, my palms damp despite the calm mask I wore. My father sat across the aisle in his prison uniform, his once immaculate hair now a shade of gray that looked like ash. He still held his shoulders straight, still carried the ghost of authority, but his eyes had dulled to something that barely resembled human. When the bailiff called order, the sound cracked through the room like thunder. The prosecutor stood her tone sharp, confident, reciting the charges like scripture. Racketeering, fraud, assault, witness tampering. Decades of intimidation reduced to paragraphs of law. Each count carried years of his life, and each word landed like a nail in a coffin. My breath stayed steady until she said the name of the final witness. Grace Leland. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. I rose my heels, clicking on the floor as I made my way to the stand. I had sworn 100 times I wouldn't cry. Not here, not now. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and faced him. The prosecutor asked the first question. Miss Leland, can you describe what happened on the night of your stepbrother's wedding? My voice came out softer than I expected, but steady. I told them about the ballroom, the chandeliers, the laughter that turned to screams. I told them about the blade, the blood, the disbelief. My words didn't shake, not until I said he looked at me after and didn't even blink. The courtroom was silent. The prosecutor nodded. And how did you feel when he was released the next day? Betrayed, I said. By him, by the system, by the idea that money could rewrite truth. She paused, then stepped aside. The defense attorney rose a man paid to manufacture doubt. He smiled like this was a friendly debate. Miss Leland, you've accomplished quite a lot since that incident, haven't you, CFO, investor, successful businesswoman? Surely someone so competent wouldn't be controlled by resentment. I met his gaze and said, resentment fades. Scars don't. He frowned, tried again. Isn't it true your actions helped bring down an entire company, costing thousands of jobs? I said, my father's crimes did that. Not me. He leaned closer. You wanted revenge. Admit it. I looked straight at him. I wanted truth. The rest was consequence. A murmur rippled through the audience. He turned away, defeated. When I stepped down from the stand, I caught my father's eye. His jaw clenched. He mouthed one word, traitor. But behind it, I saw something else panic. The illusion was finally gone. Over the next days, witnesses testified, board members, accountants, former employees. Some cried, some lied, most folded under evidence. The mountain of proof grew until even his lawyers couldn't climb it. The prosecutors ended with a recording Alex had found my father threatening a supplier to falsify documents. His voice filled the courtroom, cold and cruel. You think I care about rules, he said on the tape. Rules are for people without power. The judge's expression hardened. By the time closing arguments began, everyone knew the verdict. Still, the waiting burned. On the final morning, I arrived early, the winter light slanting through tall windows, dust motes floating like confetti. Nora sat beside me. She whispered, You did it, you know. Whatever happens today, you already won. I wanted to believe her, but part of me was still braced for some impossible twist. The judge swayed. The jury bought the truth rewritten again. But when the foreman stood, the silence was absolute. On all counts, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit like a thunderclap. Someone behind me gasped. My hands trembled not from shock, but from release. 25 years in federal prison, the judge ruled voice even. No parole restitution ordered to victims and employees. The courtroom exhaled. My father sat frozen, staring at nothing. Then he turned toward me. Grace, he said, voice cracked. His hands shook as guards moved to escort him. Grace, listen to me. For a moment, against my will, I remembered being small again, sitting on his office floor, drawing pictures he never looked at. I remembered wanting him to be proud, but that version of him had never been real. I stood slowly and met his gaze one last time. You called it family, I said. I call it violence. His face twisted rage, flaring through despair, but before he could speak, the guards pulled him away. Cameras flashed as the doors swung closed behind him. And just like that, the empire ended with a click of metal cuffs. Outside, the winter sun was blinding, Reporters shouted questions. "What will you do now?" "Do you forgive him?" I kept walking, boots crunching on snow until the noise faded behind me. At the courthouse steps, Ethan waited. His eyes were wet, his expression caught between sorrow and relief. He said softly, "He looked for you when they took him away." I nodded. Let him look. It's all he ever did. We stood there in silence until Nora joined us, a faint smile beneath her exhaustion. She handed me a folded letter. "From the DA," she said. "He'll be transferred to federal custody tonight. It's done." I looked out at the skyline, the city shimmering under pale sunlight, and for the first time in years I didn't feel haunted. I felt empty, yes, but in the best way, a room finally cleared of smoke. Later at home, I poured tea instead of wine. I deleted every news alert, shut off the phone, and sat on the floor in the quiet. Justice doesn't feel like celebration, I realized. It feels like breathing without permission. That night, I dreamt of my mother again. She stood on a dock, smiling faintly, and said, "You kept your promise." I woke with tears on my face and the sunrise spilling gold across my walls. Somewhere in a concrete cell, my father sat alone, his voice finally useless. And I, at last, was free. The snow melted into spring the same month I left Chicago behind. The city that once defined me now felt like a mausoleum filled with ghosts of boardrooms and memories. I packed my life into 3 suitcases and drove west until the skyline vanished in the rearview mirror, replaced by forests and open sky. Portland greeted me with rain and quiet, a city that breathed slower like it had nothing to prove. I rented a small apartment overlooking the river, its walls bare except for one framed photo of Zoe, my goddaughter, and a postcard from Nora that simply read, "Begin again." For the first few weeks, I barely spoke to anyone. I ran by the waterfront every morning, the cold air clearing my thoughts, the ache in my shoulder, a reminder of how far I had come. One day, as I passed a community center, a flyer on the window caught my eye. Financial literacy for women seeking independence. I stopped, heart pounding. Inside, a handful of women sat around folding tables, their faces tired but alert, pens in hand, notebooks open. The instructor was late, so I asked if I could help. 2 hours later, I found myself explaining credit scores, interest rates, and the importance of owning your own name on paper. When the session ended, one of the women hugged me and said, "You make it sound like we can win." I smiled. "You already can." That night, I wrote a business plan. The Reclaim Foundation would teach financial control and resource management to women escaping abusive relationships. It would give them what no one gave me the tools to rebuild from ashes. Within 3 months, the foundation was registered as a nonprofit, and with grants and silent donations through Northbridge, it opened its doors in a modest building near downtown. The first day, 20 women came. By the end of the month, there were 60. They arrived with stories like mine. Love turned weapon control disguised as protection. I listened, taught sometimes, just sat in silence beside them. Healing, I realized, isn't linear. It's circular, like a song replayed until the heart finally learns the words. One afternoon, as I sorted donation forms, a familiar knock came at the door. Mary Ann stood there thinner, her hair streaked with gray, clutching a paper bag. "I didn't think you'd see me," she said. I hesitated before stepping aside. She looked around the office at the posters about empowerment and whispered, "You made something beautiful." Then her voice broke. "I should have protected you." I wanted to hate her, but instead I felt an unexpected tenderness. "We were both trapped," I said softly. "You just believed him longer." She nodded, tears spilling freely. "Ethan's volunteering here next week," I added. "He wants to do something good." Her face brightened with fragile pride. "He always admired you." For the first time since the wedding, I hugged her. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was release. That evening, I found Ethan at the center stacking boxes of donated clothes. He grinned. "So this is what freedom looks like," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Spreadsheets and chaos." I laughed. Better chaos than control. He grew serious. "I visited him last week. He's not doing well." "Asked about you." I paused. "And what did you say?" "That you're alive." That was enough. Weeks passed and the foundation grew. Local news covered our program's donations poured in, and I was invited to speak at a university about economic empowerment. Standing at that podium looking out at rows of young faces, I realized that my story had transformed from a wound into a weapon of change. Afterward, a student approached me and said, "My mom's in your program. She says you saved her." I shook my head. She saved herself. The words tasted like truth. Months later, Nora emailed parole denied. "He's staying in." I stared at the screen for a long time, then smiled faintly and hit delete. No need to keep proof anymore. Justice didn't live in a courtroom. It lived in every life rebuilt from what he tried to break. That summer, I bought a small cottage outside the city, a place with tall windows and a garden overrun by wild lavender. The air smelled of earth instead of ambition. I spent evenings on the porch with tea and books instead of headlines. One night, as rain pattered softly on the roof, I lit a candle for my mother. "We made it," I whispered to the flame. "Finally." It flickered like it understood. As the foundation expanded, I hired new counselors, legal advisors, financial mentors. Each of them carried a story, and together they created something larger than any revenge could have given me, a living testament to survival. On the first anniversary of our opening, we hosted a dinner for the women who had graduated the program. They came dressed in colors, laughter filling the air. When it was my turn to speak, I said, "Once someone told me love is ownership. But love is freedom, the kind we give ourselves and each other." Applause rose like a wave, but I barely heard it. I was watching them, the proof that cycles can break. After everyone left, I stayed behind to clean up. On the corkboard by the door hung a new drawing, 5 stick figures under a rainbow with the words, "Thank you, Grace," written in purple crayon. I didn't know who had drawn it, but I knew what it meant. It was the same message I had once wished to send my mother, the same that I now carried forward. When I locked up and stepped into the night, the air was cool and bright with stars. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about learning to live beside it without fear. And I was finally completely unafraid. The ocean stretched before me like an unending mirror as the Oregon sun began to sink, painting the water in molten gold. I stood at the edge of the pier, the wind lifting my hair, the salt stinging my skin. It had been exactly 3 years since the night of the wedding, and yet sometimes I could still feel the phantom sting of the knife, the cold marble beneath my hands. But the pain no longer owned me. It simply reminded me I had survived. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small velvet box that had followed me through every move, every chapter. Inside lay a diamond ring, the one my father gave me when I was 10, telling me, "You'll always be my shining girl." I remembered how I used to twist it around my finger whenever I wanted to feel seen. Now it was just metal and memory. I looked down at it glittering in the sunset, then closed my hand around it. Behind me, the waves hissed softly against the rocks, whispering their ancient language of endings. I thought of the women at the foundation, their laughter, their stories, the way they walked taller each day. I thought of Marianne tending the community garden she'd started, of Ethan teaching financial literacy classes to teenagers, of Nora texting me last week with a photo of her newborn daughter and the message, "We named her Grace." The world had kept moving, and for once I wasn't chasing or running. I was simply here. I opened my hand again and let the ring fall. It hit the water with a soft plunk and vanished beneath the ripples. "Goodbye, Dad," I whispered, not with hatred but with a strange calm. He had written his legacy in fear. I would write mine in freedom. I sat on the edge of the pier until the sun dissolved into twilight. The sea smelled like rain and renewal. My phone buzzed beside me, an email notification. From the board of Aurora Logistics, the rebranded company that had risen from his ashes, offering a partnership with the Reclaim Foundation to fund educational scholarships for women in leadership. I smiled. The irony was perfect. His empire now rebuilding lives instead of destroying them. I hit reply approved. Let's make it happen. Afterward, I walked back toward the small cottage. The air cooled as evening deepened, the sky streaked with violet and silver. Through the window, I could see the warm glow of the lamp I'd left on the shadow of my favorite plant, the shape of a life I had built from nothing. Inside, the scent of lavender drifted from the kitchen where I'd left a pot of tea cooling. I poured a cup and sat by the window watching the waves glitter under the moon. Freedom didn't look like power or revenge. It looked like this quiet, unhurried earned. Somewhere in a distant prison, my father was counting the days, the man who once measured time only in money, now learning the cost of every second. Maybe he still hated me. Maybe he finally understood. It didn't matter. His story had ended where mine began. On the coffee table lay a notebook filled with letters I'd written but never sent to my mother, to myself, to the girl I used to be. I opened to the last page and wrote, "I forgive the silence that shaped me. I thank the fire that burned me. I am no longer waiting for anyone to save me." I closed the book and set it aside. The world outside was shifting again, the first stars breaking through. Somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted from a nearby cafe, and I realized how long it had been since I'd let myself just be part of life's noise. I finished my tea, grabbed my coat, and walked down to the beach. The sand was cold between my toes, grounding and real. Each wave rolled in with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, steady, strong, alive. I tilted my head back, breathing in the night. Every chapter that had once been written in pain was now a paragraph in a larger story, a story of reclamation, not ruin. I thought about all the daughters like me who had been silenced, doubted, betrayed. Women taught to shrink so others could stand taller. The Foundation's motto had come to me months ago, but tonight it carried a deeper resonance. "We rise from what tried to bury us." I whispered it into the wind and felt it return on the salt air. Before heading home, I looked out once more at the horizon, now a thin line of silver against the dark sea. The world was vast again, open and unclaimed. I walked back up the pier slowly, each step echoing softly on the wooden planks. When I reached the end, I turned for one last glance at the water. The waves were calm now, like they'd accepted what I had let go. I smiled, not out of triumph, but gratitude. Every ending was just another kind of beginning. As I opened the cottage door, the warm air greeted me, carrying the faint crackle of the fireplace. On the mantel sat a framed photo of the women from our first foundation class, all smiling arms around one another. Beneath it, a brass plaque engraved with the words I'd chosen for our mission, for every daughter who fought to be believed. I ran my fingers across the letters and whispered, "For all of us." Then I sat by the fire, pulling a blanket over my shoulders, and watched the flames dance. Outside, the waves kept whispering. The night deepened, but I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. Somewhere between the ocean and the embers, I had found my freedom. Sometimes at night, when the waves are quiet, I still hear echoes of that ballroom, the laughter before the scream, the silence after the truth. But it no longer hurts the way it used to. It reminds me that even in the darkest moment, the world waits for one person to say enough. Maybe that person is you. Maybe it's the woman watching this right now, sitting in her kitchen, wondering if she deserves to start over. Maybe it's the daughter who stopped calling home because love kept arriving in bruises and apologies. Maybe it's the man who grew up believing power meant control and is finally realizing that real strength is letting go. We were all told stories about family, how blood is sacred, how forgiveness means forgetting how silence keeps the peace. They were wrong. Silence only feeds the monsters we're too afraid to name. I spent years believing my pain was private, that survival meant pretending nothing happened. But survival isn't the end, it's the beginning. It's the moment you decide your life will no longer be written by someone else's cruelty. If you are watching this, I want you to remember one thing: you are not the sum of what they did to you. You are the proof that even broken things can build something beautiful. The world won't always believe you at first. They didn't believe me. They called it family misunderstanding, personal matters, just an argument. They will try to rename your wounds to make themselves comfortable. Don't let them. Tell your story anyway. Scream it if you must. Write it down if your voice shakes. Whisper it to someone who will hold it without turning away. Because every time one of us speaks, the walls that hide abuse begin to crack. And when they finally fall, we will not be the ruins, we will be the builders. That's why the Reclaim Foundation exists not as charity, but as a promise that no woman, No daughter, no survivor will ever walk through that kind of silence alone again. We build not for pity, but for power. Every dollar raised, every workshop taught, every story told, it's one more life turning pain into purpose. I learned that love is not ownership. Love is freedom. Freedom to breathe, to choose, to walk away, to rebuild. And sometimes freedom begins with the smallest word spoken out loud: no. No more hiding, no more shame. No more pretending this is normal. So, wherever you are right now, if you're watching from a small town or a big city, if you're 18 or 80, remember this: you matter. Your story matters, and if you have ever been silenced, know this: your voice can move mountains. Mine did. The waves outside my window keep whispering the same rhythm every night. It isn't goodbye anymore. It's a heartbeat. It's a beginning. Tell your story. The world is listening.